Hello and welcome to the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, helping everyday runners fuel better, run smarter, and recover faster so you can reach your full performance potential. I'm your host, Stephanie Natchek, dietitian, fitness coach, and a fellow runner too. As the owner of Stephanie Natchek Performance Nutrition, I've spent the last 10 years helping runners learn to fuel their bodies, level up their running performance, and establish healthier relationships with food and exercise. If you're ready to reconnect with your love of running, then let's get started on today's episode. So hello and welcome back to our three-part series where we are talking about the biggest nutrition mistakes that runners make, or at the very least, the biggest nutrition mistakes that I see runners making. So today we are wrapping up this three-part series. We might reopen it and do a little bit of a discussion on some more nutrition mistakes as we get down the road. But for this little series, we're going to talk about the top three. So if you haven't checked out parts 1 and parts 2, then I would definitely recommend giving those a listen. You don't have to listen to them in order. You can listen to today's episode and then go back or whatever makes the most sense for you. But we're going to dive in today on number 3 of the biggest nutrition mistakes that I see runners making, which is trying to limit or completely avoid carbohydrates in your diet. So our first big nutrition mistake was not eating enough or not eating the right amounts to fuel your training. Our second big mistake was not timing your meals around your training, not thinking about when you eat being as important as what you eat. And today we are talking about the issues that runners can run into, runners can experience when they are trying to completely limit or avoid carbs. Now, what's important to note, the first thing that I want you to understand about carbohydrates is that carbohydrates are fuel. So fuel for our muscles, fuel for our brains. And in the context of being a runner, of course, we need carbohydrates for everything we do throughout the day. We use carbohydrates for energy and for fuel all day, every day, no matter what we're doing. But specifically as runners, we need carbohydrates for fuel, especially for higher intensity efforts. So the harder we're running, the faster we're running, the harder we're training, the more carbohydrates we are going to be using to fuel those efforts. You may have heard, if you spent a lot of time, listening to nutrition discussion around promoting low-carb diets, kind of emphasizing or encouraging restriction of carbs, you'll probably hear sometimes that carbohydrates are not essential in the diet. And it's true. The term essential means that we cannot make it ourselves. So when we hear something about an essential nutrient, that means that we can't make it, so we have to get it from food. The term essential is not a commentary on whether or not we need something, our bodies need something or don't need something. It's just a matter of whether or not we can make that thing ourselves. So carbohydrates are not essential because we actually can make some carbohydrate on our own in our liver. Our liver is this really cool organ because it can do all kinds of crazy stuff. Like it just can make so many different things. It does so many different things. But the thing about making carbohydrate, making glucose, which is sugar in our liver, is that it actually requires us to use something called amino acids as a substrate or as an ingredient in making that glucose. Now, these amino acids come from protein. Now, this could be protein that we eat in our diet. It could be dietary protein, but it also can be protein from our muscle tissue. We actually will break down muscle tissue and use the protein from that muscle tissue to make glucose to fuel our exercise. This is one of the things that can happen when we aren't eating enough carbohydrate to support our training, and we can end up in a state of low energy availability, or of course, this relative energy deficiency in sport that we talk a lot about, which is essentially not eating enough to fuel our training. And then we see issues with improper recovery, higher risk of injury, not seeing changes in our body composition that we want to, or seeing unwanted changes in our body composition, like losing muscle or having a harder time reducing body fat percentage. And a lot of it comes back to this low carbohydrate availability in the sense that we aren't getting in the fuel. So we're turning to protein to do the job that the carbohydrates are supposed to be doing. So that means protein can't do its job. We don't have enough of everything to go around. And so protein isn't able to build and maintain muscle mass. It's not able to repair our damaged tissues after exercise. It's not able to support our immune system function. The most important thing to remember here is that we don't want the protein that we eat or the protein in our bodies being responsible for fueling our activity. So this is huge, especially for higher intensity efforts, right? Faster running, harder running, interval training, lactate threshold training, anything like that you might be doing. We don't want to be forcing our bodies to use protein to fuel that type of training. Yes, we do use fat as a fuel source for lower intensity exercise. It's absolutely true, but it doesn't completely negate the need for carbohydrate. And it also requires training, especially that easy zone 2 aerobic based type of training, to optimize our ability to use fat as a fuel source. So it does take some time as a runner to get better and get really good at doing that. Which brings me to my next point here. We need carbs for fuel, especially for high intensity efforts. And the more higher intensity training you're doing, the more carbohydrate you need, or the more miles you run in a week, the more carbohydrates you need. But I don't want this to sound like I'm saying that all we need in our diet as runners is carbohydrates. And if you actually just not too long ago, just earlier this season, we had an episode all about protein and the importance of getting protein in our diet as runners. So I think the big takeaway here, the big thing that I want you to remember is that we need a balance of all macronutrients, right? We definitely want to be getting in carbohydrates as runners, but that doesn't mean that we don't also need proteins and fats, right? We need all three macronutrients in balance because they all serve their own purpose and they all come with their own benefits. But if we are overly relying on one versus another, or our macronutrients are out of balance, then this is where we can start to run into trouble. And this is where we can start to see problems either with our eating habits, with our nutrition, like with meeting our nutrition goals, or of course with our performance and body composition. When it comes to carbs, the biggest thing that I see, the most common issue that I see is that trying to limit or restrict or avoid carbs, we actually create this binge restrict cycle with our eating. What that can look like is we might have a few days or maybe a few meals throughout the day where we're eating very, very low carb. We're completely missing or eliminating the carbohydrates at, a couple of meals a day or maybe several meals throughout the week. But then the pendulum swings almost too far the other direction, and we end up eating all the carbs or only carbs at other times of day. And we can really see inconsistencies with our appetite, our hunger signals, our ability to be full after a meal when our macronutrients are out of whack or out of balance. So people are eating very inconsistent amounts of carbohydrates. They're all over the place. And while it's true that we should adjust our carbohydrate intake based on our training demands, this could be anywhere from 1/5 of our plate to about half a plate at our meals, or 45 to 65% of our total calories. Yes, we do need to adjust our carbohydrate consumption based on our training demands, but that's not at the expense entirely of getting in enough protein or enough dietary fats. So it's not that our meals are going to be 0% carb or 100% carb. It's always sort of, somewhere in the middle, and we're always going to adjust, but it's not at the complete exclusion of other foods or other nutrients. What I'm referring to here, this 1/5 of a plate of carbs, or maybe up to half a plate of carbs, talking about those proportions, is something that I use in the Fuel Train Recover Club, and of course use with my one-on-one clients, which is our athletes plates, which basically is looking at the proportion of your different foods on your plate, your protein foods, your carbohydrate foods, your fruits and vegetables, etc., and just adjusting those proportions based on your training demand. So this is a really great visual tool, a really simple visual tool that we can use to be able to get away from needing to like track our calories or kind of measure and be, really detail oriented with all of that stuff in order to know that we're eating kind of the right amount for what our needs are. So it's a little bit less detail oriented, but that's ultimately a good thing because the less work it is, the more sustainable it can be. So, what I often see, as I mentioned, is runners being really inconsistent with the amount of carbohydrates they're eating and not eating the right amount of carbohydrates based on their training demands. So, not thinking about how much fuel do I need today for my workouts. Instead, it's just, a bit of a crapshoot with how much we eat this day versus that day. We're having, maybe just vegetables and protein for dinner one night. Then the next night is a big, heaping plate of pasta with nothing with it, no protein, no vegetables on the side or anything like that. And that has nothing to do with how much running we happen to be doing on either of those 2 days. Less frequently do I see runners keeping their fat content of their diets kind of within an ideal range, which for reference is about 20 to 35% of our total calories. If carbs are 45 to 65%, fats are going to be 20 to 35%. And then that leaves between 10 and 30% for protein. 10% is pretty low. I would not recommend going as low as 10% of your total calories for protein, unless, of course, your total calorie intake was quite high. Usually something more in like the 20, 25%, maybe 30% range. 30% is going to be definitely on the upper end, would be ideal for protein. But what I see most often is not people going over really high with the protein in their diets, but instead swapping out more fat calories for carb calories. So definitely going higher or over with the fat consumption and then being really low with the carbohydrate consumption. And this is twofold. A lot of protein foods do also have fat in them. So a lot of, some of the fat in our diet, a lot of the fat in our diet is going to be coming along with the protein that we eat. Protein and carbohydrates each have 4 calories per gram, whereas fat has 9. So the calories from fat just add up more quickly than the calories do from carbohydrates and from proteins. But also a lot of foods that have carbs also have fat. So fat's just in a lot of things, especially really tasty things, the things that people tend to maybe overindulge in sometimes, the things that people have a hard time controlling themselves around when it comes to overeating. As I mentioned, that binge restrict cycle can definitely be a huge issue for so many people, especially people who do varying amounts of running throughout the week. You find yourself really, really hungry sometimes and feeling like you just can't control your intake. Chocolate, chips, French fries, even nuts and seeds, they do have a lot of fat calories compared to protein or carbohydrate calories, so they can bump up the fat content of our diet despite being very nutritious. Cheese, avocado, even added fats and oils and salad dressings and stuff. So it's easy for those calories from fat to really add up and us to not realize it, especially if we're trying to minimize our carbohydrate consumption and keep our carb calories low. We can wind up just a little bit all over the place with our macros. So that is number 3. Our biggest mistakes that runners make is trying to limit or avoid carbohydrates. What can happen here when we're trying to limit or avoid carbs entirely, or at least keep them to a minimum, not time them around our training, not adapt different eating strategies when we're in higher volumes of exercise versus lower volumes, not thinking about how much we need day to day, how to adjust our plates and our proportions based on what we need, is we can end up with low energy availability, low carbohydrate availability. So we don't have the fuel we need to support our training. We can have a harder time building and maintaining muscle. We can have a harder time losing body fat. We can have a harder time achieving a level of performance that we're trying to achieve. We can have a really hard time with endurance. We're running out of gas because we don't have enough carbohydrates in our bodies. We have a hard time with intensity. We just can't hit the speed or the duration that we want for, say speed intervals and workouts like that. We can have a very hard time with HIIT training. We can have a hard time with recovery. And we can have a hard time with hunger. So we might find that we're not full. And then that hunger kind of builds and builds and builds until we end up overeating. And maybe we're choosing really high reward foods As I mentioned, things that are really tasty and have a really, great combination of fat and carb calories, which tends to be the stuff, the chips, the chocolate, the ice cream, and all of that wonderful stuff, things that we definitely want to enjoy, but of course, enjoy in moderation. So the big take home message here, like if you're sort of listening to this episode and you're like, okay, I understand, maybe this is something that I've been doing. I have been really cautious of trying to limit my carbs. I'm trying to eat less rice, bread, pasta, potatoes, avoiding all of that stuff. I'm definitely not eating too much fruit and I'm trying to be really careful. But maybe I'm not seeing the performance that I want to. Maybe I am noticing that I'm having trouble with my endurance or with my speed. Maybe I'm not building muscle the way that I think I should be, or I'm struggling a lot with hunger throughout the day, especially in the evenings. Maybe my sleep is impacted because I'm, waking up hungry or whatever the case might be. There's lots of different tells and lots of different signals that our body sends us when we're not fueling properly. The big thing that I want you to remember from today's episode is that we want to have a balance of all of our macronutrients. So this episode is not just about carbs, carbs, carbs. All you need is carbs, and that carbohydrate quality doesn't matter, because it absolutely does. We do, for the most part, want to be relying on high fiber, nutritious carbohydrate foods. And that means nutritious in the sense that it provides us with not only just carbs for fuel, but also things like vitamins and minerals. And as I mentioned, fiber. So this is going to be our whole grains, our potatoes, sweet potatoes, of course, but white potatoes are great too. There is nothing wrong with eating white potatoes, fruits, other starchy vegetables like squash or corn, and things made with whole grain wheats or other grains. So that might be, our pastas, our breads, tortillas, pitas, muffins, oatmeal, of course, another great one, quinoa. There's a big long list of foods that contain carbs. We want to be getting in those whole grains and those whole foods as much as possible. The quick carbohydrates, those rapidly digesting carbohydrates, those are going to be for just before training, those, things that we want to digest quickly, get that fuel into our bodies as quickly as possible, and for our intra-run fuel. And of course, earlier this season, I believe it was episode 3 of season 2 of the Fuel Run Recover podcast, where we talked all about intra-run fuel and options for intra-run fuel. There's a time and a place for those quick digesting, quick acting carbohydrates as well. So we want to get all of our macronutrients in balance. That's really, really important here, is to not overemphasize just one area of our diet, but to include the protein, include the fat, include the carbs, but to varying degrees in varying amounts, depending on our training volumes. Now, if you listen to the episode all about protein, we talked about how protein, your requirement and your goal for protein is relatively consistent day to day. It's the carbs and the vegetables that sort of adjust and fluctuate depending on training volumes. So what I want you to do as a runner is to have a really realistic view of the demands of your training. This is both volume and intensity. And then look at matching your carbohydrate intake to what you need for fuel. Because both underdoing it, underfueling, and of course, overdoing it, overfueling, neither are ideal, right? Neither situations are going to be great, not only because it takes away from our ability to meet our needs with our other macronutrients, right? If we're only eating carbs, we don't have enough fat in our diet, we don't have enough protein in our diet. The same way, if we don't have enough carbs in our diet, then we don't have enough fuel for our activity. So we just want to keep it consistent, keep it balanced, and keep it realistic, that we're matching our training volumes to our demands. This does not need to be complicated. It also does not require you to track calories, weigh your food, measure your food, do all of that stuff. Again, those things can be done in the short term. Nothing wrong with doing a little bit of tracking and, taking a really close look at your eating habits for a short period of time. But this podcast and the work that I do as a dietitian and a running coach is all about sustainability. It's all about helping you integrate new habits, new patterns of behavior that you can do for the rest of your life. It's not a short-term fix. It's not just for these 3 months or 4 months. I'm going to do this program. I'm going to do these really hard things for this really short time and then go back to what I was doing before, right? We want sustainability. We want to create new ways of doing things that last us for our entire lives, really work on developing those healthier relationships with food and exercise so that we're not stuck in this constant battle or this constant cycle of being on again, off again with our eating habits, on again, off again with our training, with our running. We want things to just feel easy and just feel really natural. It can take some time to get there, but I want you to know that it is absolutely achievable. Lots of my clients and people inside the Fuel Train Recover Club are doing it, are learning how to do it, and you can too. So it doesn't need to be complicated. It doesn't need to take up all of your time to be tracking and weighing and measuring your food. I love to use something called the athlete's plates for adjusting mine and of course my clients' eating meals day to day, how much they need to eat, and adjusting those proportions based on training demands. If you are looking for help with learning how to do this too, if this is something that you really want, you want to feel good about your eating, you want to understand what to eat and when as a runner, you want to understand what your plates should look like for your different meals throughout the day, depending on your training volumes, depending on the season of training that you're in, whether you're in your off season, you're base building, you're getting ready for a race, you're carb loading in the last couple of days before a race, whatever it is that you're in, whatever phase of life you're in as a runner. If you want to understand exactly how to eat, exactly how to fuel in order to optimize your performance, improve your body composition without needing to feel like you're on a diet, without needing to feel like you are restricted, without needing to track or weigh or measure your food or follow some like really strict diet plan that you can only eat this or only eat that, or, feel really limited by your nutrition strategy, then this is exactly what we do inside the Fuel Train Recover Club. We, of course, teach you everything you need to know about how to eat as a runner, everything to do with the timing of your meals, what to eat when, what foods to choose, what great options are to meet your needs. We also have full meal plans and recipe collection. So if you're looking for some actual inspiration in terms of what to eat, you're like, okay, this is great. I understand that I need protein and carbohydrates and fats in these proportions, but like, what do I make for breakfast or what do I make for dinner? We've got you covered there too. Lots of options, lots of great ideas and recipes inside the club. We also, this is really exciting. This is something that I have been so excited to make an announcement about. We also now have customizable training plans available inside the club, available for all club members. You have access to our full training program library of live customizable training programs. This is available through the Final Surge app. So all you have to do once you're in the club is get added to our roster of runners, and you can get a training plan for you that you can customize. You can share your results with me, get feedback, get coaching, and of course, help you along with your running journey, helping you become the best runner you can be, as well as teaching you how to fuel your body properly for this wonderful sport. So get all the details about the Fuel Train Recover Club. You can find that at the link in the show notes. I would absolutely love to have you in the club for this year. We have an all new monthly membership option as well. So we've got training plans, and you can join the club for as long as you want with our all new monthly membership available. Again, you can find all of the details about that in the link in the show notes. That is it for today's episode. I really hope you found it helpful as we wrap up this little mini series on the biggest nutrition mistakes that I see runners making. Whether it's not eating the right amount to fuel your training, not timing your meals, thinking about meal timing around when you're most active, or trying to limit or avoid carbs. I don't want you making these mistakes. So I hope that listening to these episodes are your first steps towards fueling your body better so that you can be the best runner that you can be. Thank you so much for tuning in. I always appreciate you listening and spending some time with me each and every week. We will be back next week for an all new episode, and I hope to see you then. Bye for now. The information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not to be used or relied upon for the diagnosis or treatment of any health condition. This information does not create a client-practitioner relationship and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice.